excited about today's Sparkle with Dr. Robert Watson. I was getting calls and emails before this asking if it would be recorded because so many people want to hear what he has to say. It's a very important discussion. And I will be hosting, as you know, we share with SSTCI Silver Spring Town Center, partners with the village on Sparkle each month, and we alternate who hosts each presenter. So next month, SSTCI is hosting an autumn art workshop, collage workshop, hosted by Lauren Lay. Lauren's an artist locally and also on our board of directors, and she's also the host of our art salon. So if you are on the creative spectrum, an artist, performer, poet, writer, filmmaker, knitter, anything along the creative spectrum, you are invited to join us for our art salon, quarterly art salon, and that is on Monday the 25th of October. And the theme is Things That Go Bump in the Night, exploring themes in our own art making that lean into the creepy. We were also celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, and we have a final program coming up on the 19th. Cuba, a Mecca of the Arts with choreographer and travel professional Janelle Cortez on Tuesday the 19th. And then in November, we always have our Veterans Concert, which will be on Veterans Day the 11th. And we will be presenting the Archie Edwards Blues Heritage Ensemble performing. We also have a special Veterans Day event with Freed. As many of you Sparkles remember, we had Freed, the female reenactors of distinction who reenact the female heroines from the Civil War, and they had the standing room only event at the Civic Building a couple of years ago when we invited them for Sparkle. So that will be on Tuesday the 9th. And we also have an interesting artist who's a veteran. She's an Air Force veteran and very talented artist, exploring new directions in the studio with artist and Air Force veteran Amy Bandel on the 10th. And we have many more events, so you can email me if you need to be added to our mailing list. But I think most of you are already members. All of our events are made possible with generous support from Montgomery County, United Therapeutics, the Arts and Humanities of Montgomery County, Maryland State Arts, and many others. And now I'll turn it back over to Doug to get us started with our wonderful speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug Gaddis, and I am Executive Director of Silver Spring Village. So first, just a little bit about the village. We are a nonprofit organization that harnesses the power of local volunteerism to support older adults who wish to continue living in their homes and communities of choice, their homes and neighborhoods of choice, and who want to continue being fully engaged in their communities, to be intellectually and socially, recreationally, culturally stimulated. We provide over 3,000 volunteer services each year, and we organize nearly 600 events around the calendar. We serve older adults. We actually don't have an age limit, but most of our members are between 50 and close to 100. And we serve individuals who live in zip codes 20901, 20910, the part of 815 that's near, that's east of Rock Creek Park, near Parkway Deli. And we recently merged with Kemp Mill Village. So we now serve the portion of zip code 20902 that's east or southeast of Wheaton Regional Park. We're delighted to be able to sponsor, co-sponsor with Silver Spring Town Center, these monthly series of conversations and other sorts of events that I was just a few minutes ago asked what we typically have. And I said, we have everything from Indian traditional poetry to astrophysics and everything in between. In addition to the upcoming events that Lisa mentioned, our December Sparkle, these are always the second Wednesday of each month, 2 to 4 p.m. The December event will be a discussion led by a village member on his new book that explores the intersectionality of race, culture, economic position, and violence in America. And then we'll have something perhaps a little happier or a little more fulfilling in February when we have visitors talking about experiences on a bus trip through the important sites in the South that are related to the fight for civil rights. And then coming up in April, we will have, I believe, the executive director of the African American Civil War Museum joining us as well. So please enjoy today. If you don't mind, please do mute yourself. And at the end of the presentation, we will be happy to take questions and you can unmute yourself at that time. Thanks a lot. And I will turn it over to Gary Klauber to introduce our speaker.
Hello, I am programs chair of the village. And this is going to be one of our best programs all year, I think. Our speaker today, Dr. Robert Watson, received his PhD in the chemical kinetics of the atmosphere from Queen Mary College, University of London, and I'm not even going to guess what year. He held 2 postdoctoral fellowships in the United States, the first at Berkeley and the second at the chemistry department at the University of Maryland, which is where I met him. In the years among his other jobs, he was chief scientist of Al Gore's mission to planet Earth. He was a senior scientific advisor to the World Bank. He was chair of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 1997 to 2002. And at least to a certain degree, based on that work with that UN committee, that committee shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. He was also co-chair and I believe chair of the United Nations Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity. In his spare time, he had appointments at as an adjunct professor at the University of East Anglia in England and Monash University in Australia, and I believe simultaneously. He has received an honorary knighthood in the UK, and in 2011 became, and this I think is, to me, the biggest honor of all, became a Fellow of the Royal Society alongside Isaac Newton, among others. Bob's talk today will be on climate change. Are the stakeholders capable of addressing the challenge? And I'm going to try to get his slides to work. Okay, Bob?
Okay. Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk with you today about this broad issue of how we humans are impacting nature and impacting the climate system. If you could make it full screen, that would be better by clicking the little button near the bottom. Normally at the bottom.
Actually, I thought it was near the top.
It looks like it's, is it full screen now?
No, still, now it is. That's
there,
perfect.
okay.
Perfect. Okay. Recently, I co-chaired a document calling Making Peace with Nature, which looked at all the environmental issues and development issues together. And that's what I'll talk to today. So the next slide, please. It says, fundamentally, we are transforming our relationship with nature. There are 4 major global environmental issues that all threaten human well-being: climate change, loss of biodiversity or degradation of nature, land degradation, and air, water, and land pollution. All 4 of these issues are totally interconnected. They affect each other, and therefore we need to address them together, both from a science position and a political position. The next slide simply shows you a slide where it's a nice circle I've only got 3 of them in there: climate, land degradation, and biodiversity. And they interact with each other. Climate change is affected by the loss of biodiversity and vice versa. Land degradation is affected both by the loss of biodiversity and climate change, etc. So all of these issues interact with each other. Equally important, they all affect human well-being. And that's what I'll talk about as we go through the talk. Effectively, what are the relationships between these issues and with human well-being? Next slide, please. So effectively, as I've said, climate change, loss of biodiversity, degradation of nature actually affects human well-being of both today's generation and future generations. And therefore, we have to recognize now that climate change and loss of biodiversity are not simply just environmental issues. They're economic issues. They affect the economy of the world. They're development issues. They affect issues such as poverty alleviation. They're social issues. They're equity issues, security issues, and moral issues. And so in reality, we should stop thinking of climate change and loss of biodiversity as simply environmental issues, as much, much more important. And indeed, if we want to eliminate poverty and hunger around the world, if we want everyone to have access to clean water and energy, if we want to have a healthy, equitable and good quality of life for everybody and leave nobody behind throughout the world, we must, it's an imperative, we must address the issues of climate change and loss of biodiversity. The next slide says effectively, what will I focus on my talk? I won't talk about everything, but I will focus on climate change and loss of biodiversity. I'll talk about what's the current status of the Earth's climate and nature. I'll talk about why they're changing. What are the implications of the changes? Can we limit the changes? And what are governments, not alone, but with civil society and the private sector, what are governments doing to address both of these issues? The next slide starts to talk about the underlying causes. Why are we seeing major changes in the environment? Well, in the last 50 years, the global economy has grown nearly 5-fold. The world population has doubled. We now have over 7.5 billion people, and we're on a pathway to 9, 10 or 11 billion people by the end of this century. International trade has grown 10-fold. Well, this increase in the number of people, and they're all on average wealthier today than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. It means with more people, wealthier people, we have an ever increasing demand for energy, food, fiber, materials, medicines, and all of these put a pressure on the environment. Now, while the average prosperity in the world has doubled in the last 50 years, we have to realize that 1.3 billion people remain poor and about 700 million people go hungry every single night. So we clearly have an inequitable world that also needs to be addressed. The next slide says, okay, the Earth's climate is changing and it will continue to change in the future. We're already 1.2 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer today than during the Industrial Revolution around 1850. We're seeing changes in precipitation patterns. Some regions of the world are getting wetter, mainly the tropics and the high latitudes. Some are getting drier, the subtropics, but there will be more heavy precipitation events almost everywhere in the world and longer spells with light precipitation. So in our area, Washington, DC, we may have incredible floods and droughts. So even in the same place, we'll have more floods and droughts. And indeed, we are seeing more extreme weather events, droughts, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, cyclones. They're becoming more frequent and they're more severe in most parts of the world. We're seeing sea level rise all around the world. We're seeing the cryosphere melting, Arctic sea ice, mountain glaciers everywhere, Greenland, parts of Antarctic melted. All of this because we are increasing the Earth's temperature. So the next slide talks about, or it shows this, I should say, look just at the right-hand side And what you'll see are two lines. There's a line sort of superimposed on pink and a line superimposed on blue at the bottom. What you see in the line in pink is a wiggly line all the way up, going up, called observed. We have 32,000 observations of surface temperature on the land and in the oceans, and they're always supplanted and complemented by satellite measurements. You also see a straight, sort of a light, pale line called simulated human and natural change. And what you see is the climate models actually simulate what we're observing globally. How can we be sure this is due to human activity and not natural phenomena? Volcanic activity, solar activity. Well, the bottom line in blue is where we've used our really sophisticated climate models to try and simulate the observations over the last 100 years, but only taking into account natural phenomena. And as you can see, the line at the bottom does not fit the observations. The next slide then says, well, do we have more than just global measurements? Yes, as I've already said, we've had measurements all around the world. At the very top on the left-hand side, they're the observed changes, which we have already seen about, on average, 1 to 1.2 degrees warming. On the right-hand side at the top are the climate models that try and simulate those observed changes. And as you can see, the patterns look really good. The land areas are slightly darker than the oceans on average. The more red it is, the warmer. And as you see at high latitudes, especially in the Arctic region, you actually see warming greatest in the Arctic, and that's also simulated. We then ran the climate models to say, what would the world look like if we had a 1.5 warming, a 2-degree warming, and a 4-degree warming? Well, why didn't we choose those? Well, later on, I'll talk to you about we're trying to limit climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5. But today we're on a pathway to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. So if we look at 4 degrees Celsius, very, very red. I mean, in the Arctic, more than 7 degrees Celsius, more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The land areas, as you can see, much redder than the oceans. We have to make sure we do not realize that world, because it will come with very, very adverse consequences. The next slide shows our precipitation. And if you look at the very top, we simulate on the top left-hand side what happens at 1.5 degrees. Then we've looked at 2 and 4 degrees. And what you can see is what I've already said. The tropics and high latitudes, mid and high latitudes, tend to get wetter on average, and the subtropics tend to get drier. In some ways, this is a little perverse. The wet areas of the world are likely to get wetter, and the dry areas of the world are likely to get drier. The next slide. Then says, well, why is the climate change? What's in these climate models? Well, it's very straightforward. We humans are increasing the atmospheric abundance of greenhouse gases that warm the atmosphere. They basically act like a blanket. The sun comes in and it warms the Earth's surface, and these greenhouse gases stop the warm air from escaping back to space, almost like a blanket around us. The more greenhouse gases, the thicker the blanket. The key gases are carbon dioxide. This is produced when we burn coal, oil, and gas to produce our energy. We also produce carbon dioxide when we cut down our forests. The carbon escapes from the soils and escapes from the vegetation as it decays. We also see methane and nitrous oxide. These are largely responsible from our agricultural practices, use of pesticides, fumigants. When we grow rice, we get methane into the atmosphere. So the next slide then moves on. Somehow the next slide isn't showing properly. Okay. Okay. Go to the next slide. Fine. What that last slide would have simply shown you was a figure of carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases increasing with time. So one would have seen a significant increase in greenhouse gases over sorry, what it would have shown, I'm one ahead, it would have shown our use of energy over the last 50 years. And we would have seen a significant increase in the use of energy in the last 50 years, primarily from burning coal, burning oil, and burning natural gas. So in 50 years, we've tripled the amount of greenhouse gas emissions due to our use of energy. This slide shows you that we've impacted the land. We have converted 3/4 of the land that's ice-free into roads, into cities, into agricultural land, into forested land. And indeed, this has also caused an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. 1/4 of the world, the Earth has been totally transformed, no connection with nature at all. And our projections suggest that by 2050, only 10% of the land will be near natural. So lots of use of energy, lots of conversion of our land. The next slide moves on to show what happens to greenhouse gas emissions due to the fact we've changed our land, due to the fact we're using more energy. And what you can simply see here is since 1990, we've seen a significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions from 40 gigatons of what we call carbon dioxide equivalent to 60 gigatons simply in the last 30 years. This is the major reason why we're seeing a change in the Earth's climate, these greenhouse gases. The next slide. Then you don't have to look at any of the details here. What it basically says is our future depends on what pathway we take in the future. What will population change be? What will the change in economic activity be? What will our demand for energy and food be? How will we produce our energy? How will we grow our food? And in the bottom left-hand corner, SSP1, is what we call largely a sustainable world. It's a world where we all work together. We limit climate change. We limit the changes to the greenhouse gases. We produce our food more sustainably. So it's a more sustainable world. In the top right-hand corner, we continue using fossil fuels at an increasing rate. We don't work together. We have a high inequality around the world, a very unsustainable world. So the only message here is we have the future in our hands. It depends how we want to develop all across the world. The next slide looks complicated. Just simply look at the top left-hand box, the very top one. And what you actually see is a line in red, a line below that in a light red, then orange, and then blue, and then very light blue. At the very top, this is if we're in our unsustainable world. This shows the emissions of carbon dioxide increasing from 40 gigatons per year up to over 120. Very high emissions of greenhouse gases. The line below is still high greenhouse gas emissions. They go from 40 to 80 by 2100. The amber line in the middle is sort of somewhat more sustainable. It keeps level for about another 50 years, then decreases. And then the low and the very low actually go down almost immediately. This is where governments, working with the private sector, working with civil society, start to take greenhouse gas emissions seriously. So depending on our future development pathway will depend on the emissions of the greenhouse gases, which will depend on what temperatures we'll see. If we're in the very sustainable light blue line at the very bottom, we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. If we're the very top high emissions line, we could see 4, 5, even 6 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. The next slide very quickly shows you the same sort of thing, basically, and it simply says, temperature can change, we can lose Arctic sea ice, the oceans become more acidic, and we see sea level rise. So again, depending on our emissions of greenhouse gases, depends not only how the temperature will change, how will we lose Arctic sea ice, what will happen to the acidity of the oceans, and what will happen to sea level rise. The next slide moves us on and says, well, what are the implications? Well, very simply, climate change affects food security, it affects water security, it affects human health. It can displace millions of people, hundreds of millions of people due to sea level rise and inland flooding. It can adversely affect nature, which I'll talk about in a minute, which all means we will have to adapt and be resilient both to the current and projected changes in the Earth's climate. The next slide says, how can we limit climate change? Well, fairly obviously, we need to stop using fossil fuels to produce our electricity and heat. We have to stop using oil to power our cars. Rather, we need to produce our energy from solar and wind and possibly nuclear. We need to use our energy more efficiently. Electric cars, albeit they are very expensive at the moment, but the price will come down. We need better insulated buildings, houses, more efficient appliances. We've got to stop deforesting the world and start to reforest our land. We need to be more sustainable in the way we produce our food. And we need to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels. Governments give subsidies for fossil fuels and transportation, and that encourages the use of fossil fuels and inhibits the use of clean energy. The next slide then moves us on what's happening internationally. With all governments in the world, including the US, agreed in Paris in 2015, we needed to limit human-induced global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5 by 2100. All countries made pledges. Unfortunately, the pledges are inadequate. They won't reach a 1.5 to 2 degree world. We'll be on a pathway to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, which would be disastrous for human well-being and nature. Governments of the world will meet in Glasgow in 2 weeks' time to agree on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet the Paris target. There'll be very, very difficult negotiations. They may succeed, they may fail. My guess is they will partially succeed or partially fail. To actually reach the Paris targets, global emissions of carbon dioxide need to be half of what they are today by 2030. And they need to be zero by mid-century, 2050. And we also need to reduce the emissions of the other greenhouse gases. The next slide is very complicated, and all you have to look at is, you can see that we've got lines going up between 2010 and 2030, and we've got things on the right showing pledges. All you need to know from this is, with the current pledges, the emissions in actually 2030 will either be comparable to today or higher than today, not 50% lower than today. To be lower than today, you need to be on that green line at the bottom, and we're not on that line at the moment. In other words, we are failing to limit human-induced climate change. The next slide says that the Paris Agreement is a really good step forward to addressing climate change. Unfortunately, unless we have stronger pledges, we will pass the 1.5 aspirational target in the middle 2030s, 10, 15 years from now, and we will pass the 2 degree target by 2050, 2060. We need to strengthen our emissions reductions. The next slide, please, moves us on to nature. This is the other big issue. Species are becoming extinct around the world, plants and animals. We have about 8 million plants and animals on Earth, and roughly 1 million of the 8 million animals and plants are currently threatened with extinction for a variety of reasons I'll talk about. The populations of most species are decreasing. Most are only half what they were only a few decades ago, and their genetic diversity is decreasing. We're destroying our forests, our grasslands, our mangrove swamps, our coral reefs, our peatlands. And next slide, please. And I've already said we're trying. This simply shows you about a series of species on the left, from cycads to conifers to reptiles to bony fish at the top. If you see a lot of green, it means to some degree a large percentage of the species are not threatened. So in other words, for bony fish at the top, you see a lot of green. It actually means that probably 85% of bony fish are not threatened with extinction today. If you go to the very bottom, cycads, you see only a small amount of green from 85 to 100. That means, say, only 15% of cycads are not being threatened by climate change. If you go to the yellow, the orange and the red, these are the percentage of species that are vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And as you can see, for most of these species, there's a lot of yellow, orange, and red. A lot of these species are indeed being threatened by human activity. The next slide just says that effectively we're destroying species hundreds of times quicker than the average of the last 10 million years. We humans are having a major impact on the loss of species. The next slide says effectively shows what's happened to a number of species. You can see that until about 1900, for some species, we hadn't lost very many. We had lost some, but what you can see for fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians, you can see a rapid increasing loss, a cumulative loss of all of these species since 1900. Indeed, we have lost 2.5% of amphibians. We've lost 2% of mammals, 1.7% of our birds, 1% of reptiles, and nearly 1% of fish. We have clearly, these are observations, not theory. We have observed the loss of many species, and it's getting worse. The next slide says why. Well, we're converting our natural ecosystems, as I've already said. We're over-exploiting our plants and our animals. For example, we've overfished most of the world's oceans. We're changing the Earth's climate, as I've already talked about. We're polluting our land, our rivers, and our oceans, and we're introducing species from all over the world that go in competition with native species and actually win the competition. So we're losing native species in competition with invasive alien species. The next slide simply shows you this quantitatively. As I've said, the big direct changes are land use change, direct exploitation, climate, pollution. And for terrestrial and freshwater system, it's primarily land use change, followed by direct exploitation, followed by climate change, followed by pollution and invasive alien species. The oceans are a little bit different, and the biggest threat is direct exploitation, overfishing. And this is while climate change is not the biggest threat to biodiversity today, if we don't limit climate change, it is likely to become the biggest threat to biodiversity in the coming decades. Next slide, please. What are the implications? Well, we're going to clearly lose species, but we're also going to affect nature. Nature helps us provide food, clean water, energy, and medicines. It reduces our vulnerability to climate change, air and water pollution, pollination, floods, droughts, pests, and diseases. It also gives us cultural and educational experiences, such as recreation, sense of place. We all like walking by a river. We like walking in a forest. We like walking on a beach. And so we're not only losing species, we're affecting the services that nature provides to people. The next slide simply shows that many species have what we call a climatic optimum area. And so the question is, what might happen to species and what percentage will lose half their climatic optimum area? We show insects, birds, mammals, and plants. On the left-hand side for each of these is what happens at 1.5 degrees warming, and on the right, what happens at 4.5. And as you can see, for insects, if we only have 1.5 degrees of warming, about 5% of species lose their optimum range. But at 4.5, 65% lose their optimum range. Similarly for birds, mammals, and plants. If we go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, major changes in where species can survive. Next slide, please. So what we have to do, well, it's obvious, we have to stop all of those direct drivers, stop transforming our land have more sustainable agriculture, limit climate change, reduce our air, water and land pollution, reduce alien species. We have to eliminate perverse subsidies for agriculture and forestry. And we have to recognize nature has value, and we have to think about that value when we make decisions. The next slide really just shows what I've said. If we want to both protect and restore life on Earth, we have to do all these things together. We need to conserve and restore our biodiversity. We need to address all of those 5 direct drivers, and we need to produce our goods and service sustainably, and we need to reduce some of our consumption patterns. The next slide simply says that internationally, nearly all governments of the world agreed in Japan in 2010 to have 20 goals to conserve and restore biodiversity. Unfortunately, none of those goals were fully met in the last 10 years, even in developed countries, and certainly not in developing countries. And we made very little progress on meeting or reducing the 5 direct threats I've talked about to biodiversity. Governments will meet again, both in China this month virtually, and again physically early next year, to agree on a new framework to protect biodiversity and set a new set of targets by 2030. Hopefully they will be more effective and monitorable than the ones we've had in the last 10 years. But governments are treating this seriously. The next slide says, boy, we've got a pandemic today, COVID-19. Well, what do we know about pandemics? Well, 75% of all new infectious diseases have their origin in animals. There are 700,000, we estimate, viruses in animals and birds that could possibly pose a threat to human well-being. We need to reduce the risk of future pandemics. How can we do that? We need to reduce deforestation, because when we deforest, people and livestock come into contact with wild animals and have the potential to pass the viruses to us. We also need what we call more hygienic wet markets, markets that sell birds and animals. They need to be much more hygienic. So we need to control the spread of the viruses. But if we get another pandemic like COVID, we need to manage it much, much better. I've only got a couple more slides. The next slide says, can we actually become sustainable? Yes, with political will. We need to use our knowledge, our ingenuity, our technology. We need to work together. We need to cooperate. And if we do, we can transform our societies and economies and be much more sustainable in the future. But it won't be easy. We need fundamental change that's technological, economic, social. We need to think how to organize society. We need to look at our worldviews, our norms, what are our values, and how do we govern ourselves. We need major shifts in investment and regulation. We need to overcome inertia. There are many that actually want the status quo. They're making profit on destroying climate. They're making profit on destroying nature. We have to overcome those that want to make a quick profit. The next slide simply says we need to actually change our economic system. We need to value, as I've said, nature, natural capital. We need to eliminate these horrible subsidies that destroy nature and cause climate change. We need to embrace sustainable production and consumption, otherwise known as a circular economy. And we have to price pollution correctly. That's internalizing externalities. By saving this money, we can then invest in low carbon, clean energy, and clean agricultural products, basically. We also need to look at our food, water, and energy system. They all affect each other. To grow food, you need water and energy. And so we need to look at the food, water, energy system together and make it much more sustainable. The next slide simply talks about agriculture and fresh water. I won't go into that. All I want to say is we can have a more sustainable agricultural system. We can feed the world. We can feed the world with affordable energy and nutritious energy, but we have to be very careful how we do it. We also need healthy diets, and we need not to waste our food. We need more plant and vegetables, less red meat. I'm not saying people should be vegans. I'm not saying they should be vegetarians, but they should consider their diet. What is healthy? And a healthy diet, less red meat, more vegetables, more fruits, will actually be good for your own human health. And the last slide actually got eliminated. Next slide, Gary. Yeah, the next slide was showing this is not just a job for governments. It's the governments, it's private sector, financial institutions, it's the international community, it's individuals like you and me, it's the NGOs, it's the media and the science community. We all have to work together if we want a sustainable world. It's possible. The time for action is now. The question is there the political will? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that presentation. It was really fascinating and covered a lot of ground that we all need to learn more about. We can take questions at this point, and I will turn off my spotlighting and I will just leave it on gallery so that we can see everyone. So if you would, it's probably best if you can do the raise hand emoji thing, but if you can't find that, just wave wildly at me like that and we will try to catch you. So give me just 1 sec to turn off my spotlighting here. Great. So do I see any questions or comments?
Gary?
Yeah, this is sort of a personal question. You come from a scientific background, and in science, as we know, the emphasis is on truth and facts and proving things and putting the things you prove into mathematical models to predict the future. However, you're now in the world of politics and policy, where a lot of the people there, the politicians especially, only use facts when they support their positions sort of backwards. So how is that for you, changing from the scientific world to the policy world?
Yeah, I've been interacting with the policy world for the last 40 years. First on stratospheric ozone depletion, then on climate change, now on biodiversity, and actually all of these now together. I would say that governments around the world now realize we've got a problem. We have to address climate change. We have to address the loss of biodiversity. They're seeing the adverse effects of climate change and they're seeing the adverse effects of destroyed nature. But luckily, many in the private sector, some of the big multinational companies, are also realizing that climate change is not good for the private sector. Losing nature is not good. Many companies rely on nature and they realize also they're having a footprint and they don't want to be regulated. So I would say that we're now seeing both governments around the world and the private sector around the world starting to realize these issues of climate change and loss of biodiversity are important. Now, in America, we've got a really bad situation. And that is, it's become a political situation. To a large extent, most Democrats believe that climate change and loss of nature is a disaster. And they want to act on climate change and loss of biodiversity. But many Republicans, on average, don't recognize that climate change is serious or the loss of nature. Now, there are some Republicans that do, no question. Some of them do appreciate it. And there's a few Democrats who don't. And in fact, you can see that when Obama was president, he actually signed America up to the Paris Agreement. Trump, who did not believe in climate change, took us out of the international agreement, and Biden has put us back in it. Countries like England, countries like France and Germany, for the last 30 years, have not had climate change as a political issue. It hasn't mattered who's Prime Minister in England or which political party's in power. It hasn't mattered in Germany who's the Chancellor or which political parties are in power. All of them have viewed that the evidence is that climate change is a serious issue and we need to address it. But unfortunately in America, in Australia, in Canada, it's a political football. And the trouble is when you have a political football and one party thinks this is a serious issue and the other party thinks it's not a serious issue, there's no consistent message to the private sector. The private sector, if they're given the right policies, if they're given the right incentives, they can address climate change. They can address sustainable agriculture, energy, water, no question at all. The trouble is when you get a flip-flop from one political party to another, it's a terrible position for the private sector. But I do see progress being made, as I've said earlier, in both governments and in industry, that these are issues. And in America, even during the Trump administration, many mayors around the world, and then Bloomberg got a significant part of American industry to start to become climate friendly and reduce the emissions. So this isn't, as I said earlier, not just an issue for governments. We need the private sector, we need the mayors in cities, we need everybody to work together.
I see two hands up. I think Mel was first and then Bruce.
And there are also some questions in the chat.
Okay. Dr. Watson, about 7 or 8 slides in, up in that upper left-hand corner, you showed CO2 generation, and that highest level, the SSP 5 to 8, seemed to top out in 2070 or 2080 and then decline. I wonder if there's anything to learn from why it began to decline. What influences that reduction?
My guess, and I have to be honest with you, I'm going to have to guess a little bit here. My guess simply is that most of these models actually have the population of the world starting to stabilize after 2050, or some of them had stabilization of population after 2050, because what we're seeing is more educated girls around the world, more empowerment of women around the world. And when you have educated girls, empowered women, fertility rates seem to decrease quite significantly. So even without strong population policies, one starts to see in many of these scenarios, the population start to stabilize. Equally, some of these renewable energy technologies and some of the energy efficient technology will automatically start to come into play. And so it's a period where probably one's seeing a stabilization in the demand for energy and a better mix between still some fossil fuel, obviously, but also wind and solar. What you see today is in about 2/3 of the world, solar energy and wind energy are starting to become cost competitive or even cheaper than fossil fuel. So even without huge political pressure, slowly but surely, one would see more solar energy, more wind energy. So I would say it's a combination of the population starting to ease off or stabilize and still a more balanced production of the energy.
Bruce, you're next.
Dr. Watson, what advice or recommendations or suggestions would you have for individuals who want to become active or improve their activity in helping to stop climate change?
To be honest, you can probably guess where my politics lie. I tend to be in the middle. I'll be quite candid. In the middle, I tend to be more a Democrat than a Republican. But I've known some very, very good Republican people like McCain and others who actually cared about these issues. Chafee from Rhode Island was really a good Republican senator that cared about climate. The first thing I would say is, if you want a sustainable future, vote for politicians that care about the future. That's the first thing. Also, use your power as consumers to send signals to the private sector that you want your goods and services produced sustainably. In other words, send a signal through the vote, send a signal through the market that you care about the future. In addition to that, and so by definition, not only voting, you can write to your congressman, write to your senator about what you would like to see them do. We can, all of us, try and save energy by being more energy efficient. As those that can afford a hybrid car rather than a gasoline car, buy it. Those that can afford an electric car, buy an electric car. If you've got a gasoline car, try and buy one that's reasonably fuel efficient. For people that go to work, many of you are retired, just like me. I'm semi-retired. Use that telecommute from home, which a lot of people have been doing during COVID, of course. Use mass transportation, basically. So if we can look at our individual lifestyles and save food, water, and energy, but the big things are try and get the political system to work for us. And that means voting for people that care about these issues.
I'm going to move to the chat. We have two questions there. Laura Breeden asks, what are your thoughts about carbon sequestration and other carbon storage technologies?
Yes, very good question. If we reforest the areas of the world where we've destroyed our forests, and that's in both developed and developing countries, but we need to reforest with what I call native species. Whatever the species of tree was before, please plant the same types of trees that we cut down years ago. People talk about afforestation, growing trees on areas where trees never grew before. That's not necessarily a good idea. Nature didn't intend to have trees there. And if we grow trees there, likely to disrupt the soils, likely to disrupt the water table. So reforestation with native species is a very good idea. Another way, we can actually use bioenergy to produce our energy. And what I mean by that is we grow grasses or fast growing trees, and then instead of burning coal, oil and gas, we burn the biomass. And that will actually then, of course, liberate carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it's a cycle. We absorb carbon dioxide when we grow the biomass, and then we release it back. It's net zero. However, we have to be very, very careful where we grow the biomass. If it displaces agricultural land, it can threaten food security. It also, if we grow it where forests are today, we lose our biodiversity in the forest. So bioenergy, if we think about it carefully, can contribute, but it can have some downsides, to be honest. And there is actually a technique called carbon capture and storage, where either with fossil fuels or bioenergy, you can actually try and capture the carbon dioxide when we use a power plant to produce electricity, and don't allow the carbon dioxide to escape to space. We liquefy it and we subduct it, we store it in depleted oil wells or gas wells or deep in the ocean. This is a technology that has some promise, but we need to do more research to see how stable the ag storage is and what the economic costs are. But that is indeed a possibility.
Okay, I'm going to skip around for some questions here. There's a follow-up to your statements just a moment ago. How can we be confident that reforestation with previous species will work in a changing climate?
Oh, there's no question. If we reforest our land with native species, as the trees grow, they will absorb carbon. There's no question about that whatsoever. And if they're native species, it's almost good, certainly good for biodiversity. It will encourage some of the original insects, animals to also come together, and some of the what I call plants, some of the other sort of other plants that typically grow in forest. So reforestation with native species is highly likely to work and not likely to have many adverse consequences.
Okay. Anna Lee, you've patiently had your hand up, or at least your icon up.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Watson, for this presentation. It's really super important. So I'm Anna Lee. I'm coming in from a nonprofit whose partial mission is to empower youth with the resources to kind of combat climate change issues. So I was wondering, in your opinion, we talked a lot about policies today and stakeholders, but what is the best way for youth to be actively involved in combating climate change?
Well, it would be the same, partially the same answer I gave earlier. The first thing is, if youth is now over 18 when they can vote, please vote. No question whatsoever. Also do the other things I said. You know, they purchase. And so when they purchase, make sure it's from companies that are sustainable. And the same thing, don't waste water, food and energy. But also get in touch with their local congressman, their local senator. Let people know. If there are peaceful marches, I fully agree. I personally am cautious about marches that sometimes turn violent. That turns people off. There's a lot of things going on in London at the moment by a group called Extinction Rebellion, and people are literally laying down in the middle of motorways, laying down in the middle of roads, disrupting traffic. And to be quite honest, they're annoying the general public. They're actually turning them off the climate issue. So marches are a really good idea. But violence must be avoided at all costs, obviously. And, you know, chaining yourself to railings, I don't personally find to be effective, but use your voice. I mean, obviously, the most visible person at the moment is Greta from Sweden. She's got voice. People in America, youth in America, demand to see your congressman or senator. Ask for a congressional hearing about youth. It's their future we're destroying. But I have to be honest, a lot of the youth, once they get past 18, often don't vote. That is a real waste of their power.
Julie asks, are there places in the world that are making significant progress in sustainability?
I don't think any country in the world is doing an adequate job. In fact, we know there aren't. Otherwise, we would have far fewer greenhouse gas emissions, far less destruction of nature. The NGOs would say no country in the world is doing a good job, but we're starting to see some good projects in different parts of the world, but they're just not at a scale that we need. So we are seeing more and more renewable energy. We are seeing more conservation of biodiversity, restoration of biodiversity. We're just not moving fast enough, and we're just not moving at the scale that we require. So there are bright lights in many parts of the world. We just have to scale up those activities. And as I said, they need to be stimulated with good government policy. And to be quite honest, for developing countries, we need to help them both financially and technologically. I mean, we have to be honest. We, the industrialized world, America, Europe, Russia, we're the ones that have largely caused the problems of the of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The cumulative emissions in the atmosphere are dominated by American emissions. Now, today, China is emitting more greenhouse gases than we are in America, and India is third. We America are second in our emissions, but per person, our emissions are still well above well above India, the average Indian, and still well above China. So there is a moral and equity issue, basically. Also, a lot of deforestation in developing countries has been to produce food for people in America and in Europe. So even some of the deforestation, not all of it, is also caused by industrialized countries demanding fruits and vegetables year round. We call it telecommuting. It's our footprint in other parts of the world. So there is a moral responsibility. We're all in this together. we need to help developing countries financially, intellectually, and with technology.
Right. Ken asks, many of the drivers of climate change have positive feedbacks. Do you think there are some feedbacks which have reached or will soon reach a point of no return, thereby resulting in runaway climate change, regardless of human attempts to control it?
We're not close to any of them at the moment, but we have to be very careful. The big one that I'm most nervous about is permafrost in the high latitudes in cold regions contains a lot of methane. And if the permafrost starts to melt, and it is starting to melt, not only in the US, Canada, Russia, in the Northern Hemisphere, we will start to see increasing levels of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Per molecule, it's more potent than carbon dioxide. So we have to try and limit the warming. Otherwise, there could conceivably be a runaway effect with melting permafrost. What we also might see are a change in ocean circulation. We don't think it's likely to happen in the next 100 years. It's called a slowdown of the North Atlantic circulation, which takes warm water from the equator up to polar regions. At the moment, it's slowing down. It's nowhere near stopping. If it were to stop, you see huge regional changes in climate. It wouldn't be a runaway effect, but it would be a dynamical effect and a radiation effect. So we do have to be very, very careful. Also, a good comment would be we might see changes that are irreversible. For example, when the world warms 1.5, and that we're at 1.2 already, 70 to 90% of warm water coral reefs will be in decline or die. At 2 degrees warming, greater than 99% of coral reefs will be in decline or die. So it's not a runaway effect, but it's an irreversible effect of what could happen with warming. If we've got much more than 2 degrees Celsius over a long, long time period, hundreds of years, we will see a mass melting of Greenland and the West Antarctic sheet, leading to meters and meters of sea level rise, which will, of course, have major effect on coastal zones all around the world.
So, Michelle, you need to unmute yourself.
How will acidification of the ocean affect those the Atlantic chain?
Yeah, what acidification of the ocean will do is predominantly affect the life in the ocean. And as it becomes more acidic, the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more the oceans absorb carbon dioxide, the more carbonic acid, it changes the pH to becoming acidic. It will have major impacts on coral reef systems, on shellfish, and on fish. So it's another adverse effect on fish. So you've got sea level rise, which is not the big issue for fish, but you have warming of the oceans and ocean acidification and pollution of the oceans. All will adversely affect fish all around. As the ocean warms, fish move northward and southward. In the northern hemisphere, they go towards the pole in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, they obviously go towards the South Pole. So what you see with climate change exacerbated by ocean acidification is a decrease in fishery, especially in the tropics and subtropics. You also see a change in the distribution of fish and the type of fish, basically. So ocean acidification is primarily a biological effect, not a physical effect. What affects ocean circulation is the ocean warming. And what happens is, as the ocean warms, the ocean goes up the Atlantic from the equator, and then it sinks around Greenland. Well, as the water becomes warmer, and as Greenland melts, and it puts more fresh water into the ocean actually becomes less dense and doesn't sink. The two reasons the water sinks over Greenland or around Greenland is it's very cold and it's quite saline. If it becomes warmer and less saline because of the melting of Greenland, it won't sink, and that can disrupt ocean circulation.
Thank you.
Mel asks that wind and solar power generation projects face a lot of opposition from neighbors that can sway local officials to disapprove of new projects. Do we need a national act that supersedes local approvals?
I mean, it's a very, very good point. I personally don't dislike either solar panels or wind power. I wouldn't mind living near either. I think one has to say to people, look, you don't like solar near you, you don't like wind, you don't like fossil fuels because it causes climate change, but we need energy. There's trade-offs here. If we don't go to solar and we don't go to wind, we'll continue to use fossil fuel. We'll continue to have climate change with adverse effects on everybody. Now, in England, we've got the same issue. And so most wind energy is almost certainly going to be offshore wind, be 5-10 miles off the shore, slightly outside of visibility for most people, except a nice cloud-free day. And so there is this sort of opposition, not just in America, but also in parts of Europe. But I think people have to realize we need energy, we need clean energy, and there are trade-offs. Whether or not federal government should overrule state government, overrule local government, hopefully we won't need to get to that situation. But in the long term, it is something that needs to be thought about, to be honest.
Great. Do I see any other hands? I think I've covered everything that was in the chat.
There was one question in the chat about nuclear. This is indeed an interesting issue. I don't think nuclear power will ever be a dominant source of energy, not fission as we've got it today. If we can ever solve the fusion problem, where we get energy without adverse effects, that would be truly wonderful. But we're close to that at the moment. We're still probably 10, 20, 30 years away from it. But with fission, which of course has the issue of nuclear waste, has the issue of potentially exploding nuclear sort of power facility, obviously the loss of fissile material for terrorists to make dirty bombs, there is an issue around nuclear and it needs to be thought through carefully. I believe personally the new really sophisticated nuclear power plants are likely to be quite safe, not likely to have a runaway explosion. But we do have to think about what do we do at the end of the lifetime of a nuclear plant? What do we do with the spent nuclear material? How do we make sure nuclear material doesn't get into the hands of terrorists? They're all reasonable issues and they're very serious issues. I do think that nuclear will possibly supply 10, 20% of the energy we need, but we need to make sure it's a safe nuclear industry, not an unsafe one. Some countries in the world, like Germany, are not willing to accept nuclear. Other countries like China, India, France, Japan, ourselves, will accept nuclear, but we have to do it carefully.
Right. Other questions or comments? We have one from Mel that just came in. Mel, can you just ask your question? It's not popping up on my screen.
Sure, it's not exactly a climate change. I'm familiar with Frank Key and his program on Resonance FM in London, the Hooting Yard program. Just wondering if you've ever listened in.
No, to be honest, I've lived here for most of the last 40, 45 years, and I haven't tuned into it, to be quite honest.
Another 45 years and we'll all see some good global warming.
Well, the problem is, and it is just as an aside, it's not an issue for Washington, D.C. But if you live in England, where it's miserable weather most of the year, the average English person would like a warmer climate. Where do most English people go if they can afford it? they go to Europe where it's sunnier in the summer. The trouble is, a warmer climate has lots of adverse consequences. So even when I was growing up, I really wanted a warmer climate. The trouble is, I know now what all the adverse consequences are, but it's a tricky one. People like sunny weather. Not an issue for Washington. We're almost too hot and humid in the summer in July and August, but lots of Europe, most people love to go out and sunbathe as soon as it's a sunny day.
Absolutely.
Doug, you might mention where people can look at the recording once we close out and you post it.
This recording will be posted to the YouTube site for Silver Spring Village. If you go to youtube.com and search Silver Spring Village, you will find our channel. This will be up possibly as early as late Friday afternoon, but if not by then, it'll be up sometime over the weekend.
The other thing is, if anybody wants a copy of those slides so they can look at them more carefully, Gary, put them on a web system. Anyone can have access to all of those slides. You know, I'm not sure many people will, but you know, one or two people might want to look at them more carefully. Totally available.
Great. It looks like Michelle has one last question, and she's still muted.
I was just wondering, I've lived in Europe for many, many years, and I feel like the Europeans on an individual level and in certain countries, governments also, are so much farther than ahead of the United States in engaging the citizenry. Why do you think we have so little real citizen impact in this country?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I mean, there's some very active NGOs in America, but whether they truly are engaging enough of the citizens, I don't know. But you're absolutely right. I think there is more citizen involvement in Europe. You also see another difference in Europe. I find that European governments have a much better relationship with the private sector and try and work together in a constructive way. Also, industry understands that government should make policy, and whereas in America, government tries to stop policy most of the time or push for subsidies, etc. So there's a very different, but there's a different relationship, both with the citizens, as you've said, and with the private sector. I think it's a healthier collaboration in Europe, in most of Europe. I know sort of England reasonably well. I don't really know the answer to it, to be quite honest with you. But yeah, it's true for a lot of issues, basically. And as I've said, the issue of climate change and even the destruction of nature is much more political here between the different political parties than it is in Europe. And that might be part of the reason that it doesn't matter which political party is in power in England, Germany, France, and Italy. They all believe that climate change and loss of nature are serious issues. So it's irrelevant which party's in power. They're willing to work with industry. They're willing to work with the public.
Yeah, I feel so frustrated because, oh, am I muted? Because in this country, I mean, you go into a supermarket or a regular store and everybody has their wallet, but most people don't have a shopping bag. It always just shocks me that they never forget their wallet, but they always forget the bag to put their stuff in.
Actually, that's interesting observation. Where I am in Potomac, you know, very similar to Silver Spring, upper middle class area, basically, I would say I would guess less than 1 to 5% of people forget their shopping bag. Actually, nearly all. I can't remember seeing someone walk out with a plastic bag, to be quite honest, at all recently. So at least here where I go shopping, people are very good on the bags.
Well, you know, when I go to the Whole Foods here in Silver Spring, And I swear to God, I'm one of the few people that walks in. Everybody gets, it's a brown paper bag and, you know, they have to pay for it. But of course, what's a nickel in the United States? So they could care less. But
So
But that's
Michelle,
why-
I'm just going to cut to a couple of other people that have got some questions that they've posted here.
Yeah.
As a follow-up, do you think America's issues with environmental injustice discourage unity against climate change?
Say that one again to make sure I understand it carefully. Say it again.
Do you think America's issues with environmental injustice discourage unity against climate change?
I don't know, to be honest. I haven't given it a lot of thought, but my answer would be probably yes, to be quite candid with you.
Let's see, we've still got questions coming in on chat. Given all this, should we prepare for a 2-degree temperature rise?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, to be honest, what we need to do is we need to think through how do we adapt not only to 2 degrees, but 3 and 4 degrees. We need to think ahead. Adaptation is almost certainly win-win, and therefore we need to be ahead of the curve. So as a minimum, we need to decide how to adapt for 2. But I would actually say we should start to plan of how to adapt to 3 to 4. So we need to mitigate, but we also need to adapt. No question at all about that.
Right. And here's an interesting question from Lisa. You can tell she's maybe one of the less experienced age people in this room. She wants to know, where in the world would you live or avoid to live 50 years from now? I would like to be looking forward to living 50 years somewhere.
Well, quite exactly. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I almost certainly won't be here in 50 years' time if something really happens. The trouble is, global warming is a global effect. Some places are affected more than others, but everywhere will be affected to 1 degree or another. Same with the loss of biodiversity, it has effects. So to be quite honest with you, I suppose America and Europe would still be the obvious places to live, given that we've actually got the financial capability and the technological capability and the intellectual capability to adapt better than any developing country. So it's only that we probably have better adaptation or survival skills, to be quite honest. So it's probably in a developing country. If you were to ask me where would I live today, it would probably be New Zealand. It really cares about climate change. The Prime Minister, a woman, as we know, has done a brilliant job with COVID. It's a wonderful country. So if you were to say, where would I live today? The 2 countries I would pick, I mean, I love America and I'm going to stay here. But other than England and America, it would be New Zealand or Norway. 2 countries that care about environmental issues, care about sustainability issues.
Lisa, are you good? You have your second half century mapped out?
Yeah, I do, but I purposely left San Diego because I could see the earth could not tolerate having so many people there, you know. And then I am considering retiring in Estonia, where I served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer, because I think it will have a Mediterranean climate by then, maybe. Keeping in mind, I can't retire. I can't afford to retire till I'm about 100 anyway.
I actually missed where you were going to go. Where was it?
Oh, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Estonia.
Yeah. Okay.
Estonia.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It seems like it might be one of the better places to live. I would think Finland or Sweden would be better than going to Spain or Italy also, if you compare within Europe.
Most Scandinavian countries are more environmentally conscious than other parts. I agree with you.
Julie, you're muted.
I think everybody's experienced lately with the supply chain issues that have confronted everybody. You walk into a grocery store and some of the shelves are not filled. You walk into a Home Depot or one of those kinds of stores, the shelves are, we're learning to adapt. we're learning to adjust to the reality of, well, we can't get X, well, Y do instead? And I think that's a harbinger for some of the things that we're going to have to do going forward.
Yeah, I think most of that, I mean, I agree with you, but I think most of that is due to COVID rather than climate change at the moment. And clearly the UK, after making their stupid decision on Brexit to leave the European Union, are seeing shortages of certain foods and energy, a combination of Brexit, where they don't have European workers, and also COVID, which has actually got a lot of people rethinking what sort of work they want to do. But you're right, we are stuck in some ways for different reasons, are thinking how to adapt. I mean, COVID itself, most people worked at home if they were lucky enough for most of the last year and a half. So we had to learn to adapt to COVID. Equally, there will be things we have to adapt to for climate change and further destruction of nature.
Well, listen, we are at about our hour and a half time here. So I want to, first of all, thank Dr. Watson for sharing his some scary information and some hopeful information. It's nice to have that balance. And also thank you to Gary for asking his old, I don't know, what is it, old colleague, mentor, etc. to join us. And of course, thanks to Lisa for co-sponsoring this with Silver Spring Town Center. Again, you will be able to see this entire presentation and discussion on Silver Spring Village on YouTube. And in terms, there was a question about where we can find the slides on the web, and I actually don't have an answer to that. So I'm not sure what to say. Maybe we'll be able to post that on the location to that on YouTube.
Maybe
So,
include in the next newsletter.
Possibly, yeah. So again, thank you to everyone. Lisa, do you have any final?
No,
comments?
this was fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. We really appreciate hearing from your lifetime of knowledge that's so important for us. So we hope to have you back.
Yeah, well, it was my pleasure. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.